Hi, I'm Pastor Corey. I'm the Associate Minister here at Orange, and we are so glad that you've joined us today.
And I'm Adam Seed. I'm the lead pastor here at Orange United Methodist Church, and thank you so much for being a part of another edition of Table Talks.
We're really excited today. I know we've covered several topics in the last 3 weeks, but today we are jumping in to thinking through what it means to worship. And we've got a great special guest with us today. It's Reverend Megan Benson, and she is currently serving as the chaplain at Duke Divinity School. She's an elder in the United Methodist Church, ordained in the Mountain Sky Conference. So we are very fortunate to have her as a transplant here in North Carolina. But before she served as the chaplain of Duke Divinity School, she was the minister of worship at Duke University Chapel. That's right, Megan. And so, and I know before I was here at Orange, I served a church beforehand, but first I was at Duke Divinity School. And so I actually was colleagues with Megan and got to know her there well. But fun fact, Megan was actually my worship preceptor when I was a student at Duke Divinity School. So she has a lot of knowledge and is a great resource for us to chat with today. And we're excited to have her. So thank you for being with us, Megan.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So we have several questions that we'd love to ask you. And the first is it's real simple and it's really broad. What is worship?
That is such a good, broad question. I think, I feel like I learned in my worship class that worship, like even the word, goes back to something being worthy of our sort of reverence and praise. And so I always think of worship as just being a time and space where you give something. In the case of Christian worship, we give the triune God. We acknowledge that the triune God is worthy of our praise and our affection. And I think we kind of gather our hearts to be transformed in that space. So that's a very broad answer, but.
So would you say that is its purpose and its function?
I mean, I think the purpose, I do think the purpose of worship is to worship the living God and to be transformed by the living God. And I don't know that that's the only purpose. I think that sometimes it's easy to mistake kind of the results of worship with the purpose of worship. So, but I certainly think that, the purpose, I always see that people gathered together to worship the living triune God is the purpose, and that there is transformation that comes out of that. And I often think that worship in some ways is rehearsal for eternity, that we are gathered with people, many of whom may surprise us, that, we are rehearsing together what it might be like to break bread together for eternity. And that worship is a place that we get to do that. We get to do that with people who are very different from us. And that, that in itself can have both challenge and gift, but yeah, it's one of the places that we are able on this side of eternity to practice what eternity might look like. And so that's kind of, what I tend to think about, some of those things.
Yeah, Megan, my dad is a retired United Methodist pastor, and so I grew up in the church. And I remember my dad would talk about people sometimes after worship on Sunday would come out and they might say to him, well, I didn't get anything out of that service today. And my dad would have two responses. One was, well, what did you put into it? And second was, it wasn't about you. And so as the people of God gather or participate in worship, particularly even in times like this, when we're worshiping in different ways, what is the responsibility of the people of God to bring to worship? What is our role in worship?
Yeah, I honestly think that showing up with an open heart is like the biggest thing that people can do. I think it's very easy, especially in times, and showing up, even if that's showing up on a Zoom or showing up, in the midst of a live stream virtually, I think there's something to be said for coming before God week after week. The practice of showing up is a spiritual discipline unto its own. And there's a great meme that you may have seen that is a worship leader, Francis Chan. It says, a random worshiper will say, I didn't really like worship today. And he says, well, it wasn't really about you.
Yeah.
And so similar to what it sounds like your dad has said. So I think that showing up is a big part of that. I do think there's something to be said for like, you will get out of worship like what you pour into it. And that coming with an open heart and sort of a heart that expects that you will encounter God, or is open to the ways that encounter might look different than even that you expect. I think there's something to be said for coming with a disposition of a humble and open heart. So I think, and I think it's the case that for many people, if you had any sort of life under your belt, that there are times and seasons where the discipline of showing up is actually pretty difficult, like for whatever reason, either because you're in a season of great grief or because, you're really struggling with your faith and with doubts. Like the discipline of showing up can be a hard discipline. But I do think there's something to be said for the value of, even there was a season where I came to the Duke Chapel before I was on staff, and we recited the creed every week, and half the time I thought, I do not know that I believe any of this. Oh. But it was actually a real gift to get to that point where like I would recite the creed and like the words were my own again, and I felt like I could say that. And so I think showing up is a big part of that, doing your best to be present and open.
One of my favorite videos that I have seen online and was an interview that Stephen Colbert did with Vice President Joe Biden. And Joe Biden was talking about the death of his son and how he was dealing with that grief. And he talked about how he would oftentimes just go to Mass and participate in the liturgy, the rhythm. And he said a lot of times it might not speak to him in that moment, but he found comfort in the rhythm and the liturgy and saying the creeds and reciting the prayers. And I think many times as we're worshiping God, God's a God that can't outbe given. So as we're giving to God, it's amazing what we do get when we give into it. So that's an amazing, great point about what we show up and be present and what we put into it.
Yeah, I agree very much.
And I love, Adam, you mentioned the rhythm and the creeds and the symbols too, that, they speak when we cannot. And so the question that I have is, what is the importance and significance? We're United Methodists, all three of us, and most of our congregation. We have some folks who are new to United Methodism or have,
as we say.
And so we know that the liturgical year is part of our DNA as a denomination. So what do you see as the importance and the significance of the liturgical year? Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. I love the liturgical year. Like I mean, some of this is I'm a person that loves ritual. I think that really we're all creatures of ritual. I mean, even if you look at, how your morning rituals, I mean, you probably have a very set ritual for how your morning unfolds each morning, how you might, even the order that you might shower, like any of those things. Like, I think we're people of ritual. And I think that one of the things that our ancestors in the faith, they were also people of ritual, and they followed sort of the signs and the symbols of the sun and the moon and the harvest and all of those things. And that began to be one of the ways that they would mark time together. And the worship professor I had always talked about the ways that like rituals at their best, like help share the story of a community. And so one of the things that the liturgical year can do is that it helps share the story of the Christian community and the Christian faith, and kind of allows a traveling, each year. And I love sort of the feast days and the high holy days and the big, big brass days, as I would say at Duke Chapel. But I also, I mean, for me, like Lent is one of my favorite seasons of liturgical year. Like, I so value that our tradition has like carved out a season for penitence, for mourning, for grief, for any of the times in our lives where we might need to come before God in the midst of a sense of desert and dryness. And like that is part of the story that Christianity tells. It's part of the story that we tell through the liturgical year. I love ordinary time. I mean, people will often say like, ordinary time isn't called ordinary time because it's ordinary. It's because of ordinal numbers and blah, 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 blah. And I always feel like it is, I mean, we should have ordinary time that is ordinary because so much of our faith is ordinary. And like, that's part of the gifts is like discovering the ways that God encounters us, not just in the mountaintops or the valleys, but in kind of just the steady day-to-day rhythms. And so for me, the liturgical year, there's just such a gift in the ways that we tell our story, and we tell that story again and again, year after year. And it involves everything from anticipating birth to anticipating death, to all of just like the core stories of our faith. And that is something that that I just cherish. So I'm always a little bit struck when, I mean, I think there can be real value in sermon series and things like that. I tend to be a fan of electionary, but I think I always feel sad when church traditions sort of lose that sense of the liturgical rhythms, because I just think it's such a beautiful part of who we are as the people of Christ. So those are my early thoughts.
Yeah. Well, as you're designing worship during the liturgical season and trying to design all the aspects, whether you're ordering the liturgy of the service, the prayers, or even trying to find a theme through a liturgical season, how do you go about that creative process?
You know, it's a good question. In some ways, I will say I am not, maybe I shouldn't say this, but the reality is like, I am not the most creatively minded person that I know. Like, I feel like I'm really good at implementing vision, but I'm not always as good at having vision. And that's not exclusively true. There's certain ways I wind up having vision around stuff, but I think in a lot of ways, I like tend to trust my resources. Like a lot of times it's easier for me to start with something and then be creative and move things around than to sort of start from scratch. I feel like there's people who have energy for starting from scratch like every week. And I always feel like I'd rather start with something and then rearrange. So I think, I do think that there can be value in thinking through things in various ways. Like I tend to be kind of a cognitive thinker in general, but I know that like thinking about images, thinking about textures, thinking about ways that you can even transform the sanctuary, maybe not in cheesy ways, but in ways that can kind of be part of telling the story, part of imparting the ritual, you know, is to be able to have, I mean, part of why I like liturgical colors is that like it's part of identifying a shift. And I think that there's really interesting things you can do with Lent with, you know, maybe dried branches and things. And that's why like when Easter comes and you have the Alleluias back and you have brass and you have flowers and, you know, like just the ways that you can kind of create some of those contrasts. So I tend to, and a lot of times, honestly, for me, it's having a team of people. Mm-hmm. Like, again, I'm really good at implementing stuff or having a sense of like what the logistics will take. But I think having a team of people who are creatively minded, to be able to sit down and just kind of reflect, like, what do we want? Because if the rituals aren't telling the story, like it's time to re-examine those rituals. And so I think that there can be value in sitting with people and saying, like, what is the part of the story that we want to tell to our community and that this community wants to share to the world in this season? So I think that tends to be how I think through things. But I do think for me, like trusting my resources is usually one of the starting points. I want to have some flexibility with ritual. Right. And be open to sort of the new things that God is doing in a community, because we do believe that we worship a living God, and that living God might be doing things differently than, God did, back when we were sacrificing animals at altar or whatever. So
I recall one of the most fulfilling experiences, and some that watch this may not believe me, but was going through the ordination process and designing the worship service and then writing the paper, explaining every choice that was made and putting that into the service and in the order that it was. And I think that many times in the church, we just go with the flow so much that we lose sight of the meaning. And I know as a pastor, and Pastor Corey, I'm sure you feel the same way at times as well. When we design a service, that from the very first words that are out of our mouth connect to the last words that are at the conclusion of the service, we know that's there. I'm not sure everybody always does, but I find such joy of being able to find that theme, that thread that connects it all throughout the entirety of the service.
I agree. I think if there's ways to have like a lot of those intersections, sometimes people would say to me when they would leave Duke Chapel, they would say, the service just flowed together so well. And I wanted to be like, well, that was on purpose. Like this was not, like I think that being able to have the hymns, to have the music, to have, the scriptures and the passage, the prayers, like to have all those things integrated. I think that is something actually that I try and work hard to do. It's a little different contexts have had different flexibility around that. And I feel like Duke Chapel was a place where there was a high level of preparation so that all the pieces would integrate. And that is not always as easy to do, but I very much agree. I think that when there is a line that kind of threads the whole thing together, I find that really beautiful.
Yeah.
I know I remember going to Duke Chapel and thinking, like, just where does she come up with these prayers for of the people? Because they were always they did. I felt like the prayers of the people in so many ways connected the service, the front end and the end. Just was so impressive to me. And so I just wanted to compliment that is true. It flowed so well together. But another question we have is, what makes worship worship? And you mentioned that we do things differently now than we did, in hundreds, thousands of years ago. So what is it at the core that makes worship worship? I know for you design and lead 3 services a week that all look different. I remember one week when I was in seminary that we had a gospel service on Tuesday, high Anglican Mass on Wednesday, and then a traditional Methodist service on Thursday. And I just remember my classmates being like, I can't believe all the places we've been this week. And it was magical in some ways. And so, but at the heart, what is it that makes all those worship services worship?
I spend a lot of time thinking about these things, especially because at the Divinity School in particular, as you've described, like we have such diverse representations of worship. And I feel like one of the gifts for me of being at the Divinity School, there's that old poem that I cannot remember who wrote it right now, but it says like Christ plays in 10,000 places. And I often think like Christ plays in 10,000 places, and I get to see several of those places each and every week. And I think in some ways, what makes worship worship, I would go back to a little bit what I said at the beginning, that it's people who have gathered to give glory to the triune God. I think there's a lot of things that we can worship. We can worship celebrities and basketball and, a lot of other stuff. But I think in order for it to be Christian worship, I guess, I would say the triune God has to be at the center of that. And from that point, I feel like I actually have a fair amount of flexibility. I might have my own preferences, and I do think, there's a reason that they talk about worship wars. Like, I think that the worship that we have been formed in, and in some cases deformed in, has often formed us or deformed us in particular ways, and that therefore people can have very, very strong feelings around worship. And it can be very hard for people to experience God in other expressions of worship. I think for me, the more I have exposure to other types of worship, the more comfortable I feel, and the more, in some ways, I feel like it opens up to me, like a deeper part of God. It's in some ways it's like an onion. Like the more that you like unfold it, the more you sort of discover. And maybe an onion isn't the best example I could have come up with, but I know that for me, like, I have come to have such a deep appreciation for the Black church tradition, or more Pentecostal or charismatic expressions. That was something that for years I would have felt much more. And I would say that that's not like where I find myself most at home. And yet the more I've had exposure, the more I've kind of appreciated the beauty and kind of that free-spirited expression. And yet I think that what sort of one end of the spectrum often is able to capture about God in the ways that they tell the story is that sense of God's intimacy and the nearness of God, and that really can come out in a lot of the more free church traditions. And then in the more formal traditions, I don't like using high church, low church, because that sort of presumes that one is actually like closer to God than the other. But in a sort of a more formal tradition like Anglican or Catholic, like, I've come to appreciate, I just think of like the mystery of some of those traditions, and how much, in some ways, like, I appreciate seeker-friendly services. Like, when I go into a Catholic setting and I think, like, I have no idea, like, I'm the most liturgically formed Methodist I know, and I'm lost in this service. And yet, like, I led a trip of undergrads to a monastery in New Mexico for many years. And when those monks would like preside over communion and like would use the incense, like, just that sense of mystery that filled the room, like, that's something that I think that a lot of formal traditions kind of get at, is the otherness of God and the mystery of God in that. And like, I've come to really appreciate, I guess, both of those things so much. And of course, Methodist tends to be a little bit more in the middle. And in a lot of ways, that's probably where I find myself most at home. But I think, I think that those are some of my thoughts. I'm not sure if that's quite the answer to your question, but.
That makes me think about when I was in seminary at Duke. One of the classes we had to take at that time was Intro to Christian Ministry, CM10. And one of the assignments we had to do was go to a worship tradition other than what we were accustomed to, and to write a paper about it. And so, growing up, the son of a United Methodist pastor, I'd had a total of 2 ministers in my lifetime, my dad and then the pastor at the church where I received my call to ministry from. So I chose a church in the nearby in the Pentecostal tradition. And I tell you what, I've been to a lot of church services. I remember so many details so clearly about that experience. And it was, while it was different than what I was used to, it was truly evident that God was present, that God was at work, and that there was worship of the triune God. And so it was a beautiful experience that I still think about, and with such wonderful memories. And I'm one of those worship nerds that when I go on vacation, I start planning where I'm going to go to church, because I want to experience something different. And so that's always been a neat thing for me. Experiencing something different helps me appreciate where I'm grounded and where I'm rooted a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that has been my experience too, especially if you go. It's easy to go in with a judgmental spirit. Let's be honest. And I don't want to act as if I've like never made judgments on other sort of, had wonderings about things, but I certainly think that going in with a charitable spirit can be a big way of illuminating, where is God at work in this place, and trusting that in fact God is also active in this community that is worshiping.
Right.
So.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more fun question that as a surprise. I love this podcast. I don't think they do it anymore, but it's called Art of the Sermon. And they always end by asking Christmas Eve or Easter, which one do you like to preach more? Or define worship more. So just a fun question, I thought. As someone who is the most liturgically formed Methodist.
I'm so dramatic. That is undoubtedly not true. I know Methodists who are more liturgically formed, but it's interesting. In terms of what I would choose to preach, I would probably choose Christmas, but in terms of what I would choose for worship planning, I would probably choose Easter. Like, for me, Easter is just the best. So, and many others on Easter this year felt very much the grief of not being able to be gathered together. And for me, I always just, I love Easter, but I honestly probably would choose to preach on Christmas Eve.
Well, our time is starting to draw towards an end. I'm grateful for the time you've shared with us today. But as you've mentioned several times, the component of worship of us gathered together, we're gathering in such different ways now. And some through live stream, some through recordings. And it's such a difficult time for us to be gathered. And so are there any words of wisdom or advice that you could share with us as we seek to worship during a time of separation and quarantine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely a challenging season because I think that so much of, the church is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ is usually not, spliced in a million different places. But I do think, and I've discovered even in these last several weeks, that worshiping via Zoom or worshiping via live stream and kind of being present together in spirit, even when you can't be present together in body, still is presence. And I think that in a lot of ways, I often think that worship is one of the ways that we form. I talked early on about how it's with whom we'll share eternity, and it's practice. And some of that is when we say the confession, we are not only learning to confess to God, but we are becoming a people who know how to confess to one another when we have fallen short of each other. When we become a people who offer prayers of thanksgiving to God, we also become a people who are able to see gratitude in our lives. And I think that those are the sorts of things that we can still do in this time, and that gathering together or having that sense of solidarity, like if you're part of a live stream, even if you're just watching a video that's been pre-recorded, there's still the gift of knowing that you and your church community are all sort of watching the same video each week, and hearing the same word proclaimed. And I think that it is hard to be able to not be together in body. And yet I also think that it would be foolish for us to think that God cannot work in these ways too. And I know that I've seen in the last several weeks of the Divinity School, we have a daily prayer service. And that has wound up being a very sacred time that injects some structure into each day. It injects a sense of holiness into each day where we're all, not every single person, but a good number of people show up every day. And it is holy. And it is something that I think that God sets apart and sanctifies and honors our hearts in showing up in the ways that we're seeking to not just give glory to God, but to continue to encounter God, because this is a time that I think it's been a life quake. It's been very unsettling for all of us. And, being able, both virtual doesn't mean it's not real. And I guess that is where I think it's easy to think that an online life is not a real life, or online worship is not real worship. For me, it may not be my preferred form of worship. And yet, I feel so grateful that we have the ability to have worship like this. And virtual life does not mean it's any less real. Our worship of God is real, and our presence to each other is real, even if it's not in this exact same place.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Well, thank you so much, Megan, for joining us today, for being open and willing to chat with us about worship and the ways that you've experienced it and the ways that you've studied it too. We're just really grateful, and we hope that, I know I've been blessed by the conversation, and hope that our congregation and those who will watch will be blessed by it. But thank you for the work that you're doing to form students and future pastors. That is a gift that we are grateful for.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you both, and blessings to all of you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for everybody for watching today. Be blessed.